We're going to talk about what many people consider to be an oxymoron, which is free market environmentalism. The slides have a green background just to be appropriate for the topic. And one of the affiliations I've had since like 1980 is the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. And a lot of the ideas here are things that were either generated by PERC or found by PERC, or I heard at PERC events. So if you are at all interested in environmental policy, then you need to go to the PERC webpage, perc.org, and start looking at stuff that's there. It is, I think, easily the best place for trying to figure out how it is that markets and the environment can interact in a far more positive way than most people tend to think. So, I am a senior fellow at PERC just because I've been around a long time. Roger Miners, who's also a senior fellow, says what we really are senile fellows. What we normally think of when we think about it, the environment and markets, is something like this. This is my cabin in Idaho. It overlooks a reservoir. We purchased 5 acres. So this is the view off the deck. Off the other end, we have that view right there. We bought the property. So, and it's 5 acres. We can take care of it. It's ours. That's how we often think about how markets and environments work. Is just something that you can buy, but there's a far broader range of ideas that work. Oh, I thought I'd taken this slide out. I'm sorry. This is my incredibly cute grandson. And my wife playing games at the table last winter. Anyway. And this is me with my, you can barely see right here, this is not another rock, that's a llama. Oh. We've had llamas for about 10 years that we use to carry stuff. I still insist on walking into the mountains, but I'm not willing to carry stuff on my back. So I spend at least a week. These are the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming. I spend at least a week there every year. Some years I spend as many as 3 weeks, and then lots of other what I would call quality mountain time. So I do consider myself as somewhat green. Here we are with our llamas, Janet and I, on our way on one of our backpacking trips. But what we normally think of about environments and markets is that they're opposed to each other, that markets destroy things. Like this is a clear cut in near Bozeman, Montana. There are no trees left standing in that whole thing. And this is the way the Forest Service used to allow trees to be cut. In fact, there was a whole segment along the hills above Bozeman, clear cut, and then trees left, then another clear cut and trees left. It looked kind of like diapers hanging on a clothesline. It's what they called it, the clothesline. We see fishing boats going out by the score for a very short season, chasing fish like crazy. We see elephants being killed for their ivory in Africa, and we see people fighting over water. And we think, wow, we've got to have government fix all of this. And what I'm suggesting is back up and ask for a minute about one of the important questions to ask in thinking about fixing any of these is, well, let's look at the basic issue. This is a cloud forest in Bolivia. This is a downstream village. Up here in the cloud forest, they have cows. They cut trees. They actually do a lot of things that affect the stream that comes down to these people. Nobody owns this property up here. These people take actions and these people pay. That's the standard definition of an externality. cost that's external to you. There's no reason for these people to be thinking about that. So when you see a problem, ask, well, who's paying? It was my server last night who was Guatemalan. I was thinking one of you were. So we have a little country like Guatemala, and 3,500 laws and regulations, environmental laws and regulations, 200 international treaties. In the US, 30% of all our really significant regulations are environmental, because we got to fix all those market failures. We have one of our big issues in the United States is the Endangered Species Act. We have these species that are being driven to extinction, and so they tend to be furry and cute. And if you get these prairie dogs on your property, you're in deep trouble, because now they have the power of the federal government behind them, and they can shut down all of your use of your property because they own your property instead of you owning it. So if you do find prairie dogs on your property, there's a different... I ask in my large classes, there are normally some kids sitting on the back row, all in their cowboy hats, and they're from ranches in Idaho or Wyoming. And I say, so if you found prairie dogs on your property, what would you do? And one of them will normally say, shoot, shovel, and shut up. You shut up because you don't want the federal agents to know that you just killed an endangered species. And you shovel it to reduce so that nobody can see that they were there. If you don't shoot them, then you get rat poison. And you just wipe them out because they're a complete cost to you. You, as the landowner, is who pays for having prairie dogs. Taxpayers don't pay for them. We have the red cockaded woodpecker in the southern United States. Now, the red cockaded woodpecker is another endangered species. It requires southern pines that are of a certain diameter. Until they get to that size, they don't nest in the trees. They don't make the holes and nest in them. And so as long as your trees aren't too big, you're not going to attract woodpeckers. So this is one of the coolest studies I've seen. If there are no colonies near you, colonies of woodpeckers near you, this is when you cut your trees at nearly 60 years. If there are a fair number of colonies near you, you're going to cut your trees at about 35 years. You're not going to take a chance of them invading you. And if there are lots of colonies around you, you're going to cut them at about 15 years. No chance at all of those woodpeckers invading your lands. So and for these kind of trees, this is about 60 years is the optimal rotation. Yes?
Was this the observed behavior, or was this...
This is the observed behavior.
Oh.
Dean Luke, L-U-E-K, who is the lead author on this study. Dean now teaches at University of Arizona. Did another study of another issue like this, found similar activity. This is called preemptive habitat destruction. You destroy their habitat before they get there. In Africa, we have, in the West, we really like elephants, don't we? Aren't they cute? But if you live in Africa and you survive with one of these big hoes, that's a mattock, clear your land and grow your crops, and an elephant comes in overnight and this is what you have left of what you were going to live on for the next year, you don't think they're cute. In fact, you might think that they are huge rats in terms of their effects on you. So they're also scary. They're really big. What we have in fisheries is we have lots and lots of hooks chasing too few fish. And this is an actual picture of one of the bays in Alaska on the opening of the halibut fishery. Kept having more and more people out there fishing for halibut, so the government would restrict the length of the season. And people would then buy bigger boats and hire more people for that short season. And they kept restricting it down to where it was a 3-day season. Well, you go out here, regardless of what the weather is, and you fish. It doesn't matter if you're sick or not, you fish. You don't sleep for the 3 days. This is called a fish derby. It's your only chance to be making money on that fishery. So, what Terry Anderson at PERC does at about this point in a talk like this is he says, well, the way you solve this problem, it just depends on which hat you're wearing. And so Terry has a whole series of hats that he can put on. This would be his rancher's hat, but we can use it, we could still get the same idea in thinking about shoes. If you are the cowboy on the ranch where there are possibly prairie dogs or wolves, you view the world much differently than if you're some student in a college of natural resources wearing your running shoes around thinking how wonderful the world is, or if you're some effete Harvard professor, or if you're a logger, or if you're just the standard campus environmentalist. Don't all of us wear Keens when we're thinking about the environment? But it's a perspective thing, and what we're suggesting is that there is a different perspective, and that perspective is what we call free market environmentalism. This is the cover of the book by Terry and Don. A new edition just came out, I think, last year. So, free market environmentalism in 2 words. Incentives matter. Another way to think of it is, if it pays, it stays. And again, this is a line from Terry. Nobody washes a rental car except for the owner of the rental car. But Janet and I have a rental car we've been using the last 5 days. Wonderful visit. We've been rained on. We've driven through some dusty roads. I'm not going to wash it before I take it back. If you don't own something, you treat it differently than if you do own it, is the point. If something pays its way, it will stay. You'll find a way to keep it around, which is why environmental entrepreneurship is so important, is finding ways for things we value in the environment to pay. So the basic questions we ask then is, who owns the environment, and how do we replace what we think of as externalities with entrepreneurship? How do we solve the problems that I showed you? The fisheries, the elephants, the clear cutting badly with entrepreneurs. So back to this picture that I showed you earlier. So here we have the people up in the cloud forest, the people down in the village. The folks down in this is an environmental entrepreneur. She created a nonprofit, raised money, so she has to be an entrepreneur in lots of ways in order to generate the cash that she needs. But she's native. She wanted to find ways to get the people up in the cloud forest to stop muddying the stream. And so she first went and offered cash. And they said, we're not part of the cash economy. Why would we need cash? What a silly thing to offer us. And so she then thought about it more and asked, well, what do you need? Turns out they needed barbed wire. If they had barbed wire, they could keep their cows fenced and controlled. And the next year, she suggested giving them honeybees too. So with barbed wire and bees, she's completely changed their behavior. They take care of that stream as if they owned it, so the people downstream who actually use it have clean water. And it was a relatively easy fix, course, she has to keep raising money to get bees and thinking creatively about what do we do to keep this system going so that it's sustainable. But solved what we would normally think of as an externality problem that requires government involvement to an entrepreneurial problem. And I thought it was really pretty clever. Several years ago in my environmental policy class, a master's degree student from the College of Natural Resources showed up. His name was Fidelis Lungu. And Fidelis was learning wildlife management. He took my environmental policy class, and we talked about free market environmentalism and lots of ideas. He went back to Zambia. The Luangwa Valley comes down through there, and the Luangwa Valley had in the previous year had 100,000. In the previous decade, 100,000 elephants had been killed. And he said, you know, we went out and we caught a bunch of the villagers who were helping the poachers. And we got them in the courtroom, and the prosecutor said, "Why did you help the poacher?" "Well, he gave me a bag of sugar." "Why did you help the poacher?" "He gave me some trousers." And he went just down the row like that, and Fidelis said, "It was like getting hit in the face with a board. I realized that the poachers were making the people's lives better, and those of us in wildlife management were making their lives worse because we were trying to protect elephants, and elephants were bad for them." So Fidelis tried to copy a system that had been put in place a few years earlier in Zimbabwe, where local villages have some control, some ownership over elephants. Now these are real pictures of a village in Zimbabwe. This is the entire village gathered under the baobab tree to talk about this great thing that they have done. They sold the safari rights to a company who brought an American hunter, and he killed an elephant. He killed him. He was a pretty big elephant. And the guy got to keep the tusks, and under treaty arrangements was actually able to take them back to the United States. Even though you can't bring in a piano with ivory keys, you could. It's complex and stupid, but. And he paid a fair amount of money. This is meat from the elephant all laid out on these fronds, and each village got its share of meat, and the village elder got 2 shares because politicians always get more, right? 'Cause we deserve it. And this is a box he's holding above his head, one of those plastic milk carton crates, milk jug crates, full of money. These are the village's money, and they're talking about how they're going to spend this money. And what they did was they voted with their dollars. They got 2 wads of money. One was the wad for their family, and the other was the one that's the communal money, what we're going to do with it in our community. And they voted here. Do we buy a threshing machine? Do we drill a well? They got enough money off of this one that they bought their threshing machine, and I assume they saved the rest of it and got more the next time and drilled a well. You say, well, those are just little things. How can that change how they feel about poaching? Well, it completely changed how they felt about poaching. This is a party that they were having, and this is, I think it's a kudu horns, and they have dollars tied to it, and they're saying, it's a way of saying the animals are cash. They're no longer nasty pests, they're good for us. They've changed how they manage their cows, so that they manage for wildlife and cows, not just for cows. It's a system that is really amazingly good until, of course, it is Zimbabwe. And Robert Mugabe is the dictator for life in Zimbabwe. And this is a cash cow. Just this really, this stream of money that was flowing in. And so the central government has started taking more and more and more. And in all likelihood, it's a system that's going to end up collapsing. But for 20 years or so, it's been really amazing. And elephant populations have skyrocketed. Other wildlife populations have gone way up. All because the people who pay are those who are willing to go hunt them, and the people who get the benefits are those who actually are living with them. I talked with an anthropologist who helped design the Zimbabwean system. His name is Marshall Murphy. And he said what he found most interesting as an anthropologist was the change in language. Because instead of talking about the elephants, the animals, it became our elephants, our animals. And one of the villages he told me about was the thing they did with their money, their very first money, was they built a school, 2-room school, and hired a teacher. Because kids in that village would walk 40 miles at the beginning of the week and walk back 40 miles at the end of the week. And in the previous year, 5 of them had been picked off by lions. You have to really value education in order to be sending your kids out where they might get eaten by a lion. But you can think about how now those wildlife are so valuable to us, where before they were a total cost. In Kenya, they don't allow hunting of animals. They allow picture safaris, and a piece I read in the National Geographic quoted a man as saying, in my grandfather's day, there was lots of wildlife. Lucky for us, we killed them all. Because in Kenya, there's no way that people living on the ground actually make any money from the wildlife. Wolves. Reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone National Park was a really big deal, and it happened primarily because of this entrepreneur, this environmental entrepreneur. His name is Hank Fisher, and Hank worked for the Defenders of Wildlife, and I don't know what's wrong with Hank. He believes that there really should be large predators wandering the West. I just don't agree with him. In fact, I don't backpack in Montana because they have so many grizzly bears. If there are grizzlies, I'll go elsewhere. There are substitutes. I'm old and slow.
So are bears.
Not grizz. My wife is slower than I am. But Hank thinks this is really important. And so he's going all over the West. This is early in the Clinton administration, talking about how we need wolves in Yellowstone and what an important thing it is. And he'd go to these local cities and towns and these town meetings, and he'd just be verbally beaten up by ranchers. And he said, I came out of a meeting in Ashton, Idaho, and was sitting in my truck in the parking lot and saw all these ranchers coming out, and they're putting on their hats and they're talking with each other about just how awful this all is. And he said, it was very much like Fidelis Lungu. Wait a minute. I'm the one who's going to benefit from having wolves, and they're the ones who are going to pay all the costs. So what if we change that? It was as if he had put on his rancher hat, because what the ranchers care about is the money they make, right? So what if we give them an insurance policy for every cow so any cow that gets taken by a wolf, they get reimbursed for it. And so Defenders actually found a donor to put up the money for this big wolf insurance plan. And it completely changed the dynamic, the political conversation. And there are now lots of wolves in Yellowstone. Hank no longer works for Defenders. He's working on with the Nature Conservancy to reintroduce grizzlies in some huge area. Told you he's nuts. But he's also figured out a pretty clever way to make money on wolves. He has these guided tours he does into Yellowstone to see wolves. His most popular one is at Valentine's Day, where they go set up in the Lamar Valley and set up their scopes, because that's when the wolves are mating. So he's selling wolf porn and making money at it. Over in the Madison Valley in Montana, there are these 50,000 acres of land that's under conservation easement that where elk come down in winter. They spend the winter on these ranchers' lands, and then so the summer's up in the mountains. And then the wolves have shown up, and so but the wolves discovered that elk run faster than cows. And so they're coming in on the cows, and they don't want them stirring up the cows and causing problems. So one clever guy decided that he would sell. Well, he discovered that if you camp out between where the wolves come from and where the cows are, the wolves stay away. You might hear them howling. It's an interesting way to spend the night. So he started selling tourist trips to his ranch to sleep with the wolves. People find really interesting ways of making money from things that you would think you can't. By the way, this is how eastern Montana tends to look. It's not as ugly as I was describing, but one of the problems with wildlife is that wildlife's owned by the state. So why in the world do you want any wildlife on your land in the western United States? Well, you do want them if your state allows you to charge people to hunt. And elk herds do really well in areas where the states allow the private landowners to charge people to hunt on their property. This is Terry Anderson from PERC with this elk that he took with his bow. He had come down this draw right here, crawling on his stomach. His wife, with her pack of stuff on, was right behind him. I told Terry, "You really owe Monica for hauling all of your gear for you." But there is a ranch in Utah, the Deseret Ranch, a 200,000-acre ranch. They charge up to $30,000 for an elk hunt. You can also buy a cow elk hunt, where you actually get to see all the big bulls, but you only take home the cow, which tend to be better eating anyway, for about $100. They have 0.6% of the elk habitat in the state, and they produce 15% of the elk. The rest of the elk habitat tends to be on public lands. So you can sell hunting rights, you can sell fishing rights. This Nelson Spring Creek, I think they charge between $100 and $200 a day per rod. So, if I were to take my grandson, and we both fish, it's $200 for the day. He's getting to be a really good fly fisher, and so I'm worried about him wanting to go someplace like this. But this is a ranch who's diversified into wildlife and as well as their cows. See, the really easy thing is you let the cows come down and they graze right up against the stream, and they just completely destroy streams. But if you fence them off, then you can work on the stream and turn it into a really great trout fishery, and then make back the money for the fencing and also more money besides. At the Deseret Ranch, when I mentioned their cattle operation pays for all of the operation of the ranch. So they don't make any profit on the cows, but it covers costs. Everything else is all profit. Clear gravy off of the elk and the deer. In Yellowstone National Park. Now, it used to be that when you went into Yellowstone, this is an old picture in Yellowstone, there were these entrance fees, But the stations were only manned from like between 9 and 10 in the morning and 5 at night. And I don't know if you've been to Yellowstone, but lots of people go in earlier than that in the morning and come in later in the evening. None of the money stayed at the park. So this isn't a free market approach. This is just saying this is a government system where we have to ask, what are the incentives? Why weren't they keeping their people there to collect all the money? None of the money stayed at the park. It all went into the federal treasury. So why collect the fees? When Dick Cheney was a member of Congress from Wyoming, he managed to get a bill through that allowed Yellowstone to charge a higher fee. So they were able to keep the difference. And then the Park Service said, well, they have extra money, so we're not going to give them as much money anymore. So they essentially took their money away, and they had to have a new bill that changed all that. But as soon as parks were able to actually charge and keep the money to use in the park, they started keeping people around to collect the fees. This is one of the really big issues in the West, is you have all of this irrigation that happens. You know, if you drive from, as we did yesterday, from Pacific Grove up to Half Moon Bay, you see, there's lots of irrigated agriculture going on there, lots of sprinklers. But what happens is that the streams get sucked dry. And I mentioned earlier today that the water rights were rights that were established from the early mining activities. And these farmers have the rights. They own the water. But they only own it if it's diverted. Interesting feature of Western state law. You have to divert it out of the stream to own it, and if you don't divert it for 5 years, then it's up for anybody else who files on it. So it's a use it or lose it rule. Even if what you do is you leave the stream like this. And this is a picture of the Ruby River in Montana, which is one of the nation's greatest trout fishing streams. So how do you keep water in the Ruby? And how do people be able to continue to farm? Well, what happened in Wyoming and Oregon and Nevada and Montana hasn't happened yet in Utah or Wyoming, I don't believe. It has in New Mexico, I don't know about Arizona, is that they've changed the law so that you can leave water in the stream and still continue to own it. So what's happened is that rather than streams looking like this, they start looking like this, because this is one in Oregon. This is the I don't remember the name of the organization in Oregon. Anyway, it's a private, non-profit organization created to keep water in the streams, and they raised money, and they went to this ranch and purchased all of their water rights after July 24th. So they use their water up till July 24th, which is when the water then has started to, the streams have really gone down, and then they stop irrigating, so the hay stops growing, and there are different arrangements with different farmers. In some cases, it's the Oregon Water Trust. I knew it would come to me. I'm old, but it comes. The Oregon Water Trust either provides them cash, or it maybe even go out and purchase hay for them. And in some cases, they lease the water. In other cases, they buy the water. But it's a market in environmental services, because somebody cares enough about the stream, not necessarily because they even want to fish. They care enough about the ecosystem, the eco-services, that they've created groups, organized themselves in a way to overcome what we think of as being market failures. The ocean fisheries, there have been some fascinating improvements made. Where it's as if we were fencing the ocean. You know, I described how the barbed wire fences made it, so that you could, your cow stayed on your side and the other guy's cow stayed on his side. Um, the phrase keeps changing. It used to be individual tradable quotas, ITQs. Now they're calling them catch shares. You own a share of the total catch. So again, this requires some agency to decide how many fish can be caught during this season. And then you, just like you own shares of water, you own shares of the catch. So you decide when you want to fish, anytime during the year, and you take your boat out and you fish more leisurely and more carefully. And if you're sick, you don't go out and you don't stay up for 72 hours. And what has happened is that season lengths have gone way up. Number of vessels has gone way down because you don't need to be participating in the fish derby. The more efficient fishers have bought out the less efficient fishers. And where these systems are in place, the fisheries are pretty stable, what you would call even sustainable. The best places that have done it are New Zealand and Iceland. The U.S. systems work fairly well. The halibut fishery works well enough that you can buy fresh halibut year-round now, instead of just during those, the 2 days after the 3-day season. There are lots of political problems in how these systems have been created, but we're so much better off than we were when it was just simply a commons, where we all went out and fished as hard as we could by creating essentially a property right in fish.
Fatalities have gone down too.
Pardon?
Fishing fatalities have gone down dramatically too.
Yeah.
People used to die because they're sleep deprived and they go out, it's crowded
And yeah.
How do you get a share?
It depends on the fishery. In some cases, you were grandfathered in. So if you already fished there, then your share of the catch was based on your historical catch. There were lots of games played and how it happened. The important thing is that it ended up happening, and then you could start having trades, so then there's a market in the shares. And as with any market, it's going to be messy at first as people try and figure things out. But yeah, it's much safer for humans. It's much better for the fish. And you can get fresh halibut year-round. What more do you want? Now this is the redfish season in the Gulf, went from 90 days to year-round. This is a really interesting example. This is from England. This stream is the Pride of Derby. And in the 1950s, the Pride of Derby, the Derbyshire Angling Association took British Ceylonese and other cities to court because they were polluting the Pride of Derby and killing fish. Now look at the fish he's got there. It's huge. It's a carp. Not something that those of us in the Western United States think of as sport fish. But they love to catch these. This mat that he's on is a special mat that you lay under the fish and lift it up out of the water, so you're doing it carefully so you can take the photo and put it back. They catch more than this. There are lots of the streams like this have salmon in them. The important thing is that the court said, that British Ceylonese said, hey, we're making the world a better place. We're producing all these products, we're producing all these jobs, and the court said, you don't own the water. The Angling Association has a right to clean water for the fish. And so they had to change what they were doing so that they weren't polluting the river. And for years now, the association hires somebody to come up and be traveling the river, checking to make sure that nobody's polluting it and destroying their fishery. It's theirs. Clear property rights.
What if the reverse had happened? What if the company had owned the waterways? Could they have how much of the river were they able to purchase anyway? If you can own like this much of the river and it pollutes upstream, I feel like it's an externality.
Well, under British common law, if you can, you identify the source of you identify the cost that's been created for you, and identify the source, regardless of how far away they are, you can take them to court and win. Now, British Celanese could have bought out the Angling Association, said, look, let us just buy your rights. I don't know if they tried, but these guys are pretty serious fishers. They like their fish, and they're willing to exercise their property rights, and they can because they own it. Ted Turner really likes bison. He really, really likes bison. He has a huge ranch in Montana that's now populated entirely with bison, and that's where the meat comes from for Ted's Montana Grills. Have you been to one? Eaten a bison burger? They're all over. He's making money from protecting a species that was once nearly gone. Just 2 more slides. Aldo Leopold, who is sort of the patron saint of the environmental movement, said lots of things. And so everybody gets to choose their favorite quote from Leopold. My favorite quote is this one, that conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner. And you might think more broadly to say it will boil down to having the right incentives, figuring out who loses, who wins, and then who pays. So if you want wolves, then figure out a way that the ranchers will benefit. And the second is Lee Perkins, who founded Orvis. And Lee practices what he preaches. He purchased some farmland in Star Valley, Wyoming, with a great trout fishery on it. They've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars making that a much better trout fishery, and they charge a lot of money for people to be able to fish on it. But all the rest of us get the benefits of that clear, clean, wonderful stream and the fish that come up and down it. So again, if you are interested in PERC and these ideas, there's the address. And I don't know what the clock says, but I've run out of things to say. The end.